You were listening to an LGBT HERO podcast. This podcast contains explicit language which some people may find offensive. LGBT HERO's Kristian Jackson sat down with a porn star, a sexpert, and a sexual health professional to talk about their experiences and perspectives on a sensitive but massively important topic for the LGBTQ+ community: consent and sexual assault. This is part one of a two-part podcast, and it's a frank, honest and uncensored discussion about sex, consent and sexual assault. Names have been omitted, but the stories are real. Some of you may find it triggering or difficult to listen to. We won't blame you for clicking off this podcast as an act of self-care. If you need help or support with any of the topics covered, please visit lgbthero.org.uk/sexual assault. I hope that if you do stay with us, that you'll find the chat valuable, informative, and yes, maybe even entertaining. And don't forget to check out part 2 of this podcast, available on your favourite platform.
I'm Kristian Jackson, Communications Manager for LGBT HERO, and we have got a lot to talk about. And joining me to discuss all this and more, I would like to first welcome Topher Taylor. Topher is a sex educator, an adult product developer, and adult content creator who also somehow finds time to be a columnist, writer, podcaster, and LGBTQ+ advocate. He's written for Cosmopolitan, and he's also been a sex agony aunt on Virgin Radio. Hello, Topher.
Hello, how are you?
I'm all right. How are you? What was like the most weird thing that you what was the weirdest problem that you had in being sex agony aunt on Virgin Radio?
I think when I found out about a special type of glue that was created for people who put light bulbs up their arse and they smash. And there's a special type of glue that was invented to extract all the broken bits of glass out.
Wow.
Yeah.
I don't think I needed to know that. And I'm maybe might have nightmares tonight, but thank you, because if I ever find anybody who's got a light bulb fetish, I will then know.
Have a time to DM me.
I'll be like, Toe, what was it again? Phil Samba, you are a longtime friend of LGBT HERO. You are a health promoter, social activist, a researcher and writer in the field of HIV and sexual health. You're also one of the hosts of The Other Blue Pill, which is a podcast about PrEP, which was produced in partnership with Queer AF and The Love Tank. Welcome. How's it been going? How has the podcast been going? Do they think you're cheating on them by doing another one?
No, I'm actually I'm the only host, but we had a producer on it. It's been going really well. It's basically like a podcast talking about how we managed to get PrEP on NHS and how it's similar to HIV medication of the 90s and also, I guess, new HIV and sexual health stuff of today.
You're a hero, and I love you. And also, finally, last but definitely not least, we have Leander. Leander has been a porn actor and in-person sex worker for over 10 years, and he's been involved in many sexual health campaigns and community messaging initiatives. He's also recently started working as an intimacy coach, and he has a PhD in neuroscience. Welcome, Leander.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Are you really a porn actor?
Why else would I be here? What did you think I was here to do? Well, let's talk about.
We had Topher, who's obviously does OnlyFans, and Phil, who does a lot of background research and in the field. And I thought you were here to talk about something like how neuroplasticity might play a role in how we consent or don't give consent, and if there's like a biological factor that we can actively change or something like that
stuff.
Yeah, I didn't, but porn's fine. I mean, we can work with we can work with it. We can work with it.
I can do both.
No, seriously. So I thought we would open. This is obviously a podcast about consent and sexual assault primarily, and I think it's something that we've all either seen, heard, or experienced ourselves. I know it's something that we've all experienced ourselves. So I wanted to just start with it. I wanted to start with by sharing our own stories of things like groping, situations that we had no consent in. I think actually, Leander, when you came to the office, I think a couple of months ago in July, you had your own one, didn't you?
Yeah, it was kind of perfect. I was on my way to have, I think, the very first meeting.
It was the first meeting.
And so I was sitting on the bus thinking like, okay, what's consent about? What's my perspective as a sex worker? Or, what are my experiences? And as I'm sitting there turning this over in my head, the gentleman on the bus seat opposite me starts feeling himself up through his shorts, maintaining eye contact with me and, making sure that I knew what he was doing. And I was like, oh, dude, like, thank you, because I'm going to take some notes now. Like, I know what I'm going to talk about now. This is perfect. Thank you, sir. But yeah, so that was
Yeah. And that was our. I mean, it was not our first meeting in real life because I've met you before, but you just walked in. You were just like, some guy was just wanking over me on the bus, and I was just like, okay, like, yeah, let's talk about that. Let's unpack that. Topher, I know that you've worked in not only just sex venues, and on sets and off sets, and in sex shops. So, but anything in particular that jumps out at you?
Gosh, I mean,
Can be funny. It doesn't have to be tragic, but
everything with me is tragic. But I was thinking about this, but when Leander was talking, there was one time I was working in a sex shop. I was 20, and it was the old Clone Zone Soho shop, which was down the other end of Old Compton Street. And I was organizing DVDs because obviously I've worked there for 400 years. And I was sorting the DVDs, and I swear to God, I felt warmth on my leg. The customer had ejaculated on my leg. Yeah, I fully like I didn't realize because I was so focused on organizing DVDs, and he fully ejaculated on me.
wow.
Yeah,
I love that you were so committed to the orderly display of DVD. You didn't know someone had come on your leg.
I know. I used to get really anal about it for the choice of the right word there, but I was like getting to make sure everything was like alphabetically perfect, and then suddenly there's like jank on my leg. I was only 20.
This is Wet Hot and Wild 1. It's not Wet Hot and Wild 2, and that's not when that's got to go before that one.
This is a Brazilian Bukkake 7, and I was like organizing them all. And then
they're all out of season.
It was all the numbers. I used to make sure the numbers were in order. So yeah, I was so distracted. That's one of many.
Did you get like after did you notice after he left, or did you like
I
then chase him for an apology and say like, dude, you just came on my fucking leg?
I mean, I didn't chase for an apology, but yeah, some stuff went down that I wouldn't say on camera. But
okay,
it was. But the scary thing is when you work in a sex shop, there's always that blurred line, and that's something you learn quite fast how to navigate, because people come in there, and then when you're someone like me who's quite like warm, sometimes I misunderstand how my warmth can make people, or they can like misunderstand my warmth and see it as come on. Whereas I'm just trying to make sure they get the right sex toy and they're comfortable in the shop. Some people that translates to I want to fuck, or
yeah.
I've worked. I'm always trying to tell the guys in our shops that just be careful of that blurred line because it's difficult to navigate, and it does.
Yeah.
It's like 3 to 6 months of working in the shop to really understand where, and just establish your boundaries very clearly. You can still be polite, but just don't ejaculate.
Yeah. I've worked in sex on premises, so I've worked in sex on premises venues, and people just felt entitled to grab you, and I'd be like, mate, if like I'm not on the menu, sorry. But yeah, that sort of entitlement. Phil, over to you.
I have a few stories, but I guess one that just came to mind was like basically lots. I think I was on Grindr one time, and someone sent me someone, you know how it is, you're talking, so chat and all that, and then they sent a picture of me to me, I didn't realize it was me at first, but I saw it and they'd like changed it. They changed the color grade to black and white, and I was like, "Is that me?" So then I went into my phone to check, and I was like, "You just sent me my own nudes." Um,
That's what I wanted to establish.
yeah,
Like, they
someone
sent me a picture of your own dick,
sent
basically.
me my own nudes. Where they got them from, I'm not sure. And like I just have lots of issues of things like
Wow.
catfishing and stuff. There's someone in South London at the moment, so I know a couple of you are in South London. If someone messages on Grindr, it's not me.
Oh shit! No, it's fine. Weirdly, the same thing has happened to me. I've had a picture of my own dick sent to me, and I'm like, dude, that's not yours. Can I?
His thing is that he said something like, "Oh, you got to be." He said something like, "Be careful because you don't know like what people are like on this app." And I was like, "But you just."
Oh my god. Um, I guess my one would be, um, like you can't really see it with my LGBT hero t-shirt, but like I am covered in tattoos. I've got them everywhere, and I also have pierced nipples. And whenever I mean, I not so much now because I'm 45 years old and I'm usually in bed by 9:30 on a Saturday night, but like when I was younger, like going out with massive tattoos and stars on your chest and pierced nipples. Um, the amount of people that used to just tug at my t-shirts and just like like yank at the arms. Like, what does your tattoo say? My tattoo says another t-shirt ruined. Thank you very much. You know, I remember being at Brighton Pride in 2019, and I had my shirt off all day. It was boiling. It was absolute boiling summer of 2019, just before the pandemic. And like, I had my nipples pierced, and people just come up to you and tweak them. By the end of the day, they were like, I had like napkins pressed against them because they were bleeding because so many people had just gone. I remember just standing at this like it was like 9 p.m. I was on my way home. I was just like, no, I'm done with this. And I was standing at like a taco truck or something like that. And there was this guy and he was just looking at me and he was like, my God, those nipples look incredible. And I was like, don't you like literally I said that if you touch them, you will be leaving this venue in an ambulance. And I meant every word of it because I was just like, I had spent the whole day just being grabbed and groped, and it really annoys me because, yeah, it just annoys me because I let that happen for so many years, and it wasn't until I actually learned what boundaries were, and now like when anybody crosses them, they get the full force of like 35 years of unresolved issues. Um, but I mean, those are just some of the things that happen to queer people on a daily basis. What I want to know is how we got here. And I think, Phil, I'm going to start with you.
I think it's been quite normalized in queer culture,
Yeah.
but I think that's as a result of, I guess, being queer not seen as the norm. And then if you think about like, particularly in this country, historically, when you think of Section 28 and how that's probably affected all of us because we're all above the age of like 30. I think it came in 2003. No, it finished at 2003. It came in 1988. So before I was born, until I was 13, queerness was not allowed to be discussed. Like the promotion of homosexuality was not allowed to be talked about in schools or in kind of those sorts of spaces. So therefore, there isn't like a language around it. And then you connect that into sex education and how even today, inclusive sex education that I guess previous governments have promised, which we're not getting. It's just like it's not like something that comes up. Like you don't talk about consent when we talk about sexual health. Like a lot of our experiences are focused on straight people having sex and pregnancy, and there's nothing on getting tested. There's nothing on consent, and if that stuff isn't, I guess, part of the conversation from a young age, then it's going to affect all of us as we're adults. We're not going to learn what those boundaries are or how to put them in place.
I grew up in an era, I grew up under Thatcher, under Section 28. Like, but my parents didn't have a fucking clue how to raise a gay kid. Like, you know, there was no playbook for them. I don't blame my parents for not being able to raise me as a gay man, but I also think, from my perspective, I always kind of call my, millennial stroke Generation X, that in between. I always call us the lost generation, because I feel like we grew up with a lack of mentors in the community, because half of them were dead and the other half so fucking traumatized they weren't able to, like, come here, little 16-year-old, let me take you under my wing and actually show you the ways. So there was nobody to teach us, and I hope that we're sort of like getting to a point where we are actually acting as mentors to the younger community, because Gen Z seems to, I mean, I don't understand their slang, but they seem to be getting it, right? But that does actually lead us nicely into something I wanted Leander in particular to talk about, because it's social media has obviously, boomed, and that has shifted the social contract. It's shifted the way we present ourselves in public online, but it's also caused a shift in the way that we can be perceived. And Leander, I just want to pass you the mic to kind of see if you can talk about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I use social media in two contexts. I use it in a work context and I use it in a personal context. So it's always interesting to see the things that are, common to both. And I think that, one thing that social media has done is it's kind of blurred the lines a bit. So people, like myself, who are sex workers, in the past, it was very clear sort of who was and who was not a sex worker. But these days, it's a bit blurrier. There are people who they wouldn't necessarily consider themselves to be a sex worker, but they do have an OnlyFans account. And there are people who maybe, daily post thirsty gym pics. You know what I mean? There's a kind of soft line now between people who do sex for work and people who do not. In between now, there's all these sort of steps along the way. And so I think, I don't know, like, to go back to the story on the bus, it's never acceptable and I'm never happy about it. But as a sex worker with a public sexual persona, it is something that I've kind of gotten used to and I've learned how to deal with it. But, there are a lot of young people now who are starting out on social media, maybe dipping their toe in sex work very often while they're students, and they're still very young, they're still very vulnerable, and I don't necessarily think that they have been given all the information that they need to understand what their consent strategies need to be. So yeah, I think whether or not people get into full-on sex work or not, there are lots of people now, more than there used to be, who occupy that kind of position in the middle, where some people out there may think that they have permission to do more than they would with just a random member of the public. And I know people that have said to me, like, oh, this person just did X inappropriate thing, and then said to me, oh, well, you're always posting those gym pics, like, what did you expect would happen? Or like,
Yeah.
oh, well, I know you've got that secret OnlyFans account, so you've basically sold yourself anyway, like, you shouldn't be complaining about it, which is just terrible. Like, this is not
Yeah.
the consent language that we want to be out there at all.
And you're right, like, it's getting, even if they're not, you said people are like dipping their toe into OnlyFans. It might not even be dipping their toe into OnlyFans. Like you said, it just might be that, they like to post a thirst trap on social media, like, every day. This is me at the gym today. The whole, like, the classic sort of like, look at my new socks type picture. And that's okay. It's fine to be proud of and to celebrate your body. But then there is a slew of people who are completely unprepared for what happens when you meet these people IRL, so to speak, or what happens when these people have access to you in in real life, in real time, when you're not necessarily wearing the armor of sort of the persona that you project on social media.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's weirdly common between the two contexts is that you sort of have this social relationship with somebody, whether you know it or not, for a long time before you may eventually have some sort of interaction. So the other person spends a lot of time building up what they think you are before you even get a chance to have that interaction, where in the past it was usually the case that you were meeting someone in person straight away, so you didn't have time to form this alternate version of them in your head, which then
Yeah,
confounded.
I
yeah,
definitely agree with that. I think there's an element of parasocial relationships because people may follow you on social media, and even though I'm not a sex worker, like just even being involved, like working in sexual health, and because like I guess having a any kind of public platform, people just assume that they know you or they have access to you at all times, and I think that's part of the problem. Social media has created this kind of dynamic where if you followed someone, if you've seen some videos or some pictures of someone, that you you should have access to them in real life as well as online. It's very bizarre.
yeah,
I just wanted to jump in just because I have a
yeah. Go for it.
perspective on both sides of that, because for years and years, via like the sex shop company I worked for, I booked sex workers to be models, dancers at our events or anything we're sponsoring at Pride, and I would have to personally stop people from sexually assaulting them for a good 33.3% of the day. And especially at events like Pride, where people get more progressively drunk and they recognize them from social media, they feel very empowered to run up, smack, grope. On one occasion, he won't mind me mentioning it, someone tried to insert two fingers inside of someone. And this is just because they'd built up this idea of them because maybe perhaps they follow them on Twitter, perhaps they're subscribed, perhaps they've seen them on like Pornhub or X videos or Just for Fans, wherever. And then on the flip side, doing work which is kind of gradually bubbling more public in an underground way and also in a mainstream way myself, like little pop-ups on TV and magazines and stuff. People do just feel like, I mean, even if it's not touching you or like physically assaulting you, it's really being very overly intimate or sexually aggressive with you to your face, talking to you about your anus, talking to you about wanting to fuck you. Do you want to come to the bathroom and stuff like this? And you're like, I'm sat in a booth at a restaurant, not looking to have like double penetration right now. I'm just waiting for my mac and cheese. But I mean, I laugh about it, but I also wanted to touch on something that I think we all touched on earlier, is that as queer people, and we learn about consent and boundaries, unfortunately, because of the lack of education we've had, we learn through being assaulted. We learn through being violated. And I think that is the biggest crying shame with all of it, is that there are young queer kids of whatever gender who don't understand that very dangerous blurred line between someone having a joke and being flirtatious and someone actually assaulting you and someone violating you or violating your privacy. So I think that's my biggest bugbear with this, all these debates and the way that queer people get used as like weapons in arguments, is that at the end of the day, it's going to be the young people who suffer because they won't really understand yet. And I was the cockiest teenager in the whole world. I was so arrogant, thought I was so smart. But I look back and I had so many horrific things done to me that I just didn't recognize were horrific until I had retrospect.
No, I completely agree because we didn't have, well, like I said earlier, we didn't have mentors, we didn't have parents who could, so we had to learn through like having sex with people and having bad sex with people and having like often non-consensual sex with people. There was, my boundaries around sex. I mean, God, I mean, I don't know if I had any in my 20s, to be honest. And I was in a relationship for most of my 30s. So it was really like, wasn't until my mid 30s that I myself started having sort of and I was also an addict as well. Like I was a complete car crash in my 20s. It wasn't until my 30s that I got sober. So I guess it was like getting sober and then sort of relearning about myself. And I know that that's like well, it's the case for many, to be honest. But you know, that's a pretty unique path. But I mean, like to Phil and to Leander, like, how did you learn about consent and boundaries? Like, what were your experiences?
God. I think that like most queer people learn about those things, as Topher was saying, through kind of relationships, sex and friendships. I think because, like I was saying, you don't really learn those things in school. A lot of the time, I guess in your in your instance, Kristian, like you didn't get that education at home either. So if you're not being taught at home, you're not being taught at school, you kind of have to figure it out as you go along. And it sometimes doesn't always work out well. We tend to have these quite like quite negative experiences as a result of not having the tools to be able to navigate these things.
I kind of picked up, a lot of consent language in my own life, but then I think through sex work, I was kind of forced to really almost codify it, if you know what I mean. So I think
Yeah.
before I had a very sort of wishy-washy, like, oh, like I'll know when I see it if it's inappropriate, and I'll decide what to say in the time. And I'm a fairly adaptable person. I'm sure I'll just figure it out as I go along. But I think through sex work, you really get into a position where you are the person that has to police the whole situation, and it's your responsibility to, you know, make make the boundaries explicit and then enforce them and monitor them. And I think that was, it's a strange sort of blessing actually to be forced to have to do it in such a like
Mm.
systematic way for the sake of work. But what you come out with it at the end is a very clear idea of what consent is and how how to work with it. Um, so yeah, I think maybe what we need is some kind of situation where people are encouraged to actively think about it in that way, um, even if they don't necessarily have that responsibility in a work context the way that sex workers do. No.
Yeah, which is actually a very, very nice, neat segue into my next sort of big point that I wanted to raise, which is titled "Why Boundaries Are So Fucking Important." Um, and I remember when we were chatting, Leander, and you were talking about like an experience where you wasn't a particular experience. You mentioned obviously being on set and there's there's two of you or more possibly, and you're on a set with people and you're ready to film, and there is a certain level of consent that's already implied. But then I remember you speaking about instances where actually you kind of went over, or just talk me back through what you were talking about then, because you're a lot better at it than I am.
Well, I lived it.
I was like, do you remember that thing that you said? Then, yeah, say that again.
Yeah, it's interesting actually how, so I've been doing porn for 10 years, and it's interesting how the sort of etiquette and manners have changed. Because I think when I started, there was a lot less explicit conversation about what people were and weren't okay with. You sort of, again, sort of go back to the phrase that I used before, like everyone sort of had this idea that they would figure it out as they go along, and we'll know if it gets inappropriate. We'll just know. And I think what's happening now, which is great, is that there's an expectation now that before any filming happens, before clothes come off, that people actually kind of have, and it doesn't need to be people don't sit down with moderators or anything. It's very casual conversation. It doesn't have to be so officious, but there is a conversation where people just check in and just say, like, is there anything I need to know? Is there anything you don't like? Is there anything that you want me to avoid? Are there any words you don't like, me using? That's really important with people of different backgrounds, whether people are, cis and trans. There's a lot of, what may seem to you to be very harmless vocabulary that can actually be very triggering to people. And those are tied in with consent as well. Just taking that moment to be like, hey, is there anything I need to know? Do you have a trauma that means that if I grab your neck or something,
Yes.
I just need to know those sorts of things, and I won't do it. And it's just, I think it's been good to see that those have become more commonplace and more established. And I think that actually we should all be doing that during hookups, during meetings, during everything, is just making that a very normal part of sexual interaction, because it doesn't need to be a big deal. It can just be a very quick, like, is there anything I need to know? No, great. No, me neither. Cool, let's go.
I mean, we're going to go talk a little bit about sort of the language of consent, and sort of how while you are having sex with people, how you have to keep asking for consent if you want to do different things, certain things, and we'll come back to that. I know we're talking about, a lot of people watching this might be going, well, but I'm not a sex worker, so let's open this up to the floor. What does this look like? We spoke about being on set with a certain level of consent already implied. Let's think about queer spaces like a dark room, a sex venue, where, as Leander said, a certain level of consent is already implied. I know you're not going to have a conversation in a dark room about, like, did you have any childhood trauma that means you don't like being strangled? But, what are those kind of like non-verbal or even verbal things that people can do to imply consent and, open to the floor, I guess?
I think kind of similar to how Leander was talking about, during sex work, you can go into it with very clear boundaries. I feel like in places like dark rooms and saunas, those sorts of things, it's like the opposite. It's like you go into it knowing that there are, like, I guess people have this assumption that there are literally no boundaries. I feel like people think that if you're in that space, then you're consenting to anything goes, which is similar to what we were talking about with people having parasocial relationships and thinking that they have access to everything, or entitlement to anything or everything. But I think a resolution in those instances, I guess, the spaces themselves, the people that run these spaces have like some sort of they have responsibility in their policies and things like that. But I also think it's about important knowing what your boundaries are going into those spaces. And like, what do you want when you go into those spaces? Being very clear about what you want before you enter those spaces, because you may know what you want, but other people aren't gonna immediately respect that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I worked on a sex on premises venue, and it was a naked night. We always used to say you might leave your clothes at the door, but you do not leave your right to consent at the door.
I've just started working with a company. Obviously, I can't name them, and they've just launched they're a very famous UK sex party who are like notorious, and they're very well known and well established because of the emphasis they put on consent. So, for example, that they're like cis heterosexual parties. Well, I mean, mostly heterosexual, from my understanding. It's you can't approach a woman; the woman has to approach you. So that's very well established, and they've now established a queer version. And just going on to what Phil said, I do think the people that run the events do have a responsibility to make the boundaries and the rules very like abundantly clear. Like there should be no space, the no gray area, because I think everyone should know. And I mean, if we are going to separate it into different areas, there are clubs who have designated areas for anything goes. There are certain clubs which have designated areas where if someone is bent over, dressed like a horse, there's one club I know in London, that means they are, consenting to having sex with whoever. But I think we should put a lot of pressure on club owners, especially people running these kind of venues, not the venues, because I know most of them are traveling nights that move from different venues, but we should put on the promoters to make sure the boundaries are clear and that everybody visiting has a clear understanding on arrival of what the rules are within these events, and how that is moderated. And there should be people and security and team members around rooms. And then also to encourage the confidence in people visiting these venues to feel comfortable, like, setting their own boundaries and, saying no, and being aware that, not, I don't want to sound like I'm victim blaming here, but when we are in sex club environments, people are under the influence. People do push boundaries, and to go into that environment confident enough to say no, and know that if you do say no and someone is pushing, that you know who to ask for help, or
Yeah.
there is a security just here, or I think but the number one priority should be that the people running these events don't just do it for the glamour and the sex and the social fun side of it, that they are taking responsibility and making sure that every single person who goes in, I don't care if the queue is 1,000 people long, every single person entering that venue should confirm on arrival they understand what the rules are.
That's a really good point. I wanted to come back to something someone said earlier, I think it was Leander, about the language of consent. And I think you were saying, like, over the years, like it's kind of like, because you've been in the porn industry for so long, and because you've been it's been kind of like hard coded into your DNA as just this language. So I wonder, like, it's the language of consent is like saying yes when you're already actually having sex, like that kind of give me some examples. I want to hear some examples, and you can be explicit or not explicit, but I think it's an important conversation to have, because it's not just like, hey, you and me, we're having sex. Yeah, right. Come on then. And we'll come on to some of the stories that I've heard, but I've heard some stories of people consenting to one thing but not consenting to another thing, and because they haven't been asked, it's just been assumed or forced on them. So I think it's important to talk about the language of consent, and how we keep asking for consent or keep offering consent.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure we're all familiar with the phrase, but maybe some people aren't, that consent is ongoing. And that's, critically important, because surprises happen, and you may go into something with fairly open consent, and then you suddenly find yourself confronted with somebody who's now behaving in a slightly different way, or they're doing something that you didn't expect. And so you need to have their respect at all times to be able to say, okay, I'm now not okay with this, or I was okay with this and now I'm not. And one of the most important things that really needs to be like reiterated is that you don't need an excuse to declare a consent boundary at any time. I don't need to have had childhood trauma to people don't touch my neck. As it happens, I like that. But if I didn't, it doesn't matter. I don't need, to have, I don't need to give a reason for any of my consent boundaries. They are what they are, and that's it. But I tell people sometimes that it's important to me as a performer that I model consent language in my scenes. And I've had some people, most people get it, but I've had some people sort of say to me like, oh, like, how do you do that and keep the scene sexy? Like, how do you incorporate sex language? And the answer is like, well, this is the sort of language that we should be using anyway. It doesn't have to be officious and verbose, and you don't need to bring in, touchy-feely vocabulary necessarily to talk about consent. It can be as simple as, is this okay? You've just started to penetrate someone, and you're about to sort of, go further or a bit harder or a bit rougher, and just stopping for a second and being like, is this okay? And you don't need to, turn the lights on and, or anything like that. You lean over, you say it in their ear, you whisper it, you roughly, demand it, you do whatever it fits. But, small things like that make a big difference. And it needs to happen no matter what the sexual dynamic is. Consent is important in dom and sub relationships. Consent is important in kink dynamics. It's important in all of these situations. And just because you are a dom doesn't mean you're excluded from the consent system. No, you still rely on the consent of the sub. And the way you do that is you hide it in the language that you're already using. So if you're going to ask, if you're a daddy and you're asking your sub or whatever, if the thing that you're about to do is okay, you're going to say something to them like, daddy's going to do this, isn't he? Or isn't that's what you want, blah blah blah. But using
I'm gonna do this.
That's the problem. Using leading language like I'm going to do this and waiting for someone to disagree with you is not asking for consent. Because you're putting that person who's already on the asymmetric, so in the asymmetric relationship, they're already in the slightly submissive position. So to just make a declaration and hope that they're going to interrupt you and be like, actually no, that's not going to happen. It needs
Having
to
thought about it.
Exactly.
Is it more about turning that statement, that sort of direct statement, into a question? So instead of saying daddy's gonna fuck you, you want daddy to fuck you? Yeah. Boing. That kind of thing. You want it hard? Yeah. You want me to do, and that, because that's hot still. It's not like, excuse me, I'd just like to seek your permission to, it doesn't have to be dry and sexless. It can just be woven naturally into the language.
That's the end of part 1, but not the end of the conversation. Why not head over to part 2, where we discuss gaslighting culture, entitlement, the language of consent, and what we can do as a community and as individuals to create a culture of consent. And of course, if you need help or support with any of the topics we've covered, please visit lgbthero.org.uk/sexual assault.